This year, in October, we will mark the 70th anniversary of the execution of the Nazis at Nuremberg. The trial at Nuremberg is often looked at as a model of justice in international law, but as I noted recently in an article and commentary, for the first Nazi executed at Nuremberg, the trial embodied not multilateralism, but rather the revenge of the Jews. It was on October 16th, 1946, that Julius Streicher was taken to be hung. As Newsweek reports, he did not die with dignity. Quote, "He had to be pushed across the floor, wild-eyed and screaming. 'Heil Hitler,' he said. Mounting the steps, he cried out, 'And now I go to God.' And then, as Newsweek reports, 75 years ago this year, he stared at the witnesses facing the gallows and shouted, 'Purim Fest, 1946. Purim Fest, 1946. Purim Fest is a reference to the Jewish holiday of Purim, which marks the tale told in the book of Esther, the rise of Haman as vizier of Persia, his attempt to wipe out the Jews. In the end, Haman himself is hung on the gallows, and later, following a war against his allies, Haman's 10 sons are hung as well. In invoking Purim, Streicher drew on an anti-Semitic trope that had a long German lineage, which claimed that this holiday, more than any other in the Jewish calendar, exposed the Jews as bloodthirsty villains. Hundreds of years before Streicher was hung, Martin Luther had written that the Jews, quote, "are real liars and bloodhounds, who have not only continually perverted and falsified all of Scripture with their mendacious glosses from the beginning until the present day. Their heart's most ardent sighing and yearning and hoping," he continued, "is set on the day on which they can deal with us Gentiles as they did with the Gentiles in Persia at the time of Esther. Oh," Luther continued, "how fond they are of the book of Esther, which is so beautifully attuned to their bloodthirsty, vengeful, murderous yearning and hope." End quote. Now, in the midst of this plethora of lies, these many malignant, malicious assaults on the Jewish faith, there is one profound truth. Jews are indeed fond of the book of Esther. They love and revere this woman, this queen, this leader for whom the book is named, whose heroism saved our people from the genocidal aims of Haman the Agagite. And therefore the invocation of Esther by Streicher is striking. Hitler was indeed a modern-day Haman, and those hung at Nuremberg were his spiritual sons. And eerily, just as the book of Esther concludes with the hanging of 10 sons of Haman, exactly 10 Nazis went to the gallows on that day. The link between Haman and Hitler reminds us why Jews celebrate Purim, not because we Jews are bloodthirsty, but because the tale of Esther reminds us that evil must be fought before it is too late. The Persia of Esther was the Germany of its day, a center of civilization that suddenly empowered a genocidal maniac. The only difference is that in Persia, this proto-Hitler and his proto-Nazi allies were defeated in time. Jews reread Esther annually in order to relearn the lessons of the Purim story. That precisely in a world of insecurity and evil, it is the heroism of Esther and the downfall of the wicked that must be joyously marked. There is great wisdom in the old joke, supposedly originating in the 1930s, in which a Jew predicts that Hitler would ultimately die on a Jewish holiday. When asked by his friends how he has such foresight, the Jew confidently replies, "Because any day that Hitler dies will be a Jewish holiday." The book of Esther, in other words, is a source of great wisdom, and the woman who gave the book her name emerges as our political pole star. That the book is known as Esther rather than Mordechai may seem initially strange, because after all, it is Mordechai who first inspires resistance to Haman. It is Mordechai who galvanizes Esther into action, and it is Mordechai who emerges instead as vizier of Persia at the end of the book. Mordechai is indeed heroic, but if it is Esther for whom the book is named, it is because it is Esther rather than Mordechai whose political instincts are most on the mark, and who therefore emerges as a singular statesman in Jewish history. And we can only understand this if we appreciate the profoundly political location where her story unfolds, which is known in the text as Shushan HaBirah, Shushan the Birah. This is often mistranslated as Shushan the capital, but that is not quite right. The larger city, the entire capital of Shushan in Persia, is referred to in the book as the Ir Shushan, the city of Shushan. But most of the story takes place in a much more limited location, Shushan HaBirah. The word Birah appears elsewhere in the Bible to refer to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. In other words, the Birah is the edifice toward which all of the city turns its gaze. So here in Persia, the Birah of Shushan is meant to conjure the palace complex, the court of the king. And the characters in the story are entirely made up of the king's ministers and courtiers. Thus, just as any consideration of statesmen such as Thomas More or Thomas Cromwell cannot take place without an analysis of the intrigue in, say, Hampton Court Palace, nor can we consider the influence of Cardinal Richelieu without, say, an analysis of Versailles, so too we cannot understand Esther without an appreciation of the terror, intrigue, and anti-Semitism that lay at the heart of the court of the king of Persia and his ministers. And so tonight, drawing primarily on how my great-uncle Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik of blessed memory analyzed and interpreted the dynamics at work in the palace of Achashverosh, I will seek to explain why this Jewish queen that gave this profoundly political book her name is indeed a woman for all seasons and a role model for Jewish statesmanship in our age. The opening of Esther paints a picture of the palace and its environs. We are introduced to the king Emperor Achashverosh, reigning over much of the known earth, engaged in a lavish and hedonistic celebration of his magnificence and might. The Talmud famously questions whether this monarch that we meet in this party is wise or foolish, but the answer would appear to be both. A king does not exercise total power over an empire as an idiot. And if, as seems likely, Achashverosh is to be identified as Xerxes, then he is a ruler of astonishing power indeed, but also one with the capacity for foolish decisions. In understanding King Achashverosh, the best parallel perhaps can be found in Henry VIII. Henry was a king of enduring influence, but his paranoid rage at a courtier who had let him down, or his lust for a woman, would often lead him to make decisions that were rash in the extreme. Henry relied on Cardinal Wolsey for every aspect of his reign, until the cardinal's failure to secure an annulment of his marriage from the Pope led him to toss his loyal servant aside. Henry was world famous for his defense of the Catholic faith, until his desire for Anne Boleyn led him to think otherwise. And ultimately, Thomas More, therefore, was replaced with Cranmer and Cromwell. Achashverosh is similarly brilliant but mercurial, but with one important additional element. It is especially when he is drunk that his profound paranoia and unchecked rage makes itself manifest. There are some statesmen, ladies and gentlemen, who succeed despite or perhaps because of their penchant for drink. Harry Hopkins, FDR's right-hand man, recalls finding Winston Churchill one morning, quote, in bed in his customary pink robe and having, of all things, a bottle of wine for breakfast, end quote. Now that's the breakfast of champions. And this lifestyle didn't seem to hurt him at all. Not in his wisdom, not in his statesmanship, and not, I would add, in his health. One of my favorite stories about Churchill recounts a young photographer who had come to take the Prime Minister's picture on the occasion of his 75th birthday. And the photographer says to Churchill, Prime Minister, I hope that I will merit to be able to take your picture on your 100th birthday. And Churchill looks at the photographer and he says to him, I don't see why not, young man. You seem to be in perfectly good health. So that's Churchill. But the king of Persia is very different. When he indulges in drink, what emerges is a terrifying propensity to rage at those who he believes are acting against him. And that rage, in turn, often results in the immediate issuing of edicts that are carried out, whatever the consequences. This is the court of the king to which we are introduced at the beginning of the book. While drunk, Achashverosh requests the presence of his queen Vashti so that his lecherous court can gaze upon her. When she refuses, he immediately orders that she be put aside, which could very well refer to her execution. Only after the drunkenness and rage subside does he realize how hastily he has acted, and that he now needs a new wife. He therefore conducts an empire-wide beauty contest, in which woman after woman is brought to him until he discovers one which he truly desires, and seeks to be with more than once. The fact that this disgusting spectacle of a pagan emperor sampling women is not all that different than the rancid reality shows that can be seen on television today highlights the despicable depths to which our own culture has sunk. That, however, is a subject for another lecture. What is important is that the winner of this contest comes from a family of Jews who are so successfully assimilated that they have gone from political prisoners to accomplished, acculturated courtiers in one generation. Thus we are told, Ish Yehudi haya b'Shushan Abirah, there was a Jew in the court of Shushan, and his name was Mordechai, son of Yair, of the family of Kish, who was exiled from Jerusalem with King Yechonia at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel. And he raised Hadassah, also named Esther, his first cousin. Jews who read these words today have no idea how shocking they once were when written, and that one in fact discerns a deep dialectic, a profound tension in this description. On the one hand, we discover that Mordechai is a Jew, and not only a Jew, but a descendant of Kish, the once royal family of King Saul. Mordechai's father Yair, we are further informed, was, with the exiles of King Yechonia, taken from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, when the king, prior to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, sought to remove all of the elite from the sacred city. This means that he comes from a family of Jewish leaders, a family once esteemed in the Jewish capital. On the other hand, this very verse also informs us that in the Persia of this biblical book, the Jews, at least Mordechai's family, have become so culturally assimilated that they have taken on not only Persian attire and Persian mannerisms, but most shockingly Persian names, because Mordechai and Esther are definitely not Jewish names. If you visit the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, you will see one of their most cherished exhibits, the reconstructed gate of Nebuchadnezzar, named the Gate of Ishtar, called thus after the Babylonian goddess Ishtar and dedicated to the Mesopotamian god Marduk. These are the gods from whom Esther and Mordechai's names are derived, Ishtar and Marduk. Today, of course, Mordechai and Esther have become Jewish names, but Marduk and Ishtar are pagan divinities, and thus to the classical reader of this story, a deep tension would have been sensed. This is a tale where one of its very heroes, where the heroes have names that are clearly not Jewish names, but indeed linked to a foreign religion. Jackie Mason has a routine in which he mocks American Jews for their penchant for Gentile names, and he said, quote, "They're trying to out-Gentile the Gentiles. I know a girl, her name was Crucifix Finkelstein." Mordechai HaYehudi, Mordechai the Jew, is the pagan equivalent of Crucifix Finkelstein, and the very name demands that the reader immediately ask, what is his true identity when he faces a choice? Will he side with his people? And our initial doubts about Mordechai would be founded not only on his name, but also on the historical context. The tale occurs after the Persian Empire has allowed Israel to leave the lands of exile and return to their homeland. And if Achashverosh is to be identified with Xerxes, then the tale also occurs after the temple has already been rebuilt, which means that the Jews who are now still in Persia are those who have chosen to stay, to not return to the Holy Land. They are those who have become comfortable with diaspora life, even as a return to the Holy Land has been made available. Something which, if we think, at least hypothetically, we can conjure in our own minds. As modern commentators have noted, the fact that the word birah in the Bible can mean either a pagan palace in Persia or God's temple in Jerusalem highlights the hard truth that Mordechai is a man who, for whatever reason, chose not to return to the rebuilt Jerusalem where his father had once served as leader, chose instead to serve Achashverosh in Shushan, rather than God in his temple. We are thus inspired to ask, how assimilated is he? Meanwhile, Mordechai, at least, is known by the court to be Jewish. The same cannot be said for his first cousin, who was brought before the king. Her Hebrew name, Hadassah, is never divulged, nor is her Jewishness and familial link to Mordechai. Upon Esther's encounter with the king, she is immediately proclaimed queen, And though she is indeed beautiful, the odds are that in an empire with millions of women, there were others as fair as she. Thus, her success, her emergence as the victor of the Bachelor Persia edition, must lie in something even more alluring than her looks. What we discover, if we read carefully in Esther, is another capacity, an elusive quality, described by the text as the ability to find favor in the eyes of all she encountered. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik has called this her charm, inner strength, divine charisma. But I believe it's best known today as emotional intelligence. It is an ability to read the situation in which she finds herself and to respond accordingly, a skill that will allow her to embody the first great example of diaspora statesmanship when a threat to her people presents itself. The threat is not long in coming. King Achashverosh elevates the chief minister Haman Ha'agagi, Haman the descendant of Agag, who was king of the Amalekites, the historic enemy of Israel, who Saul, the most famous figure of Mordechai and Esther's family, once failed to kill. Though Achashverosh orders all to bow to Haman, Mordechai engages in civil disobedience. He is a loyal servant of the king. We are further informed that he uncovered intrigue at the court and saved the king's life. But he cannot honor this great enemy of his people. Thus, at this very moment, Mordechai, when bowing would have been so easy, suddenly reveals his profound loyalty and identity as a Jew. Upon witnessing Mordechai's lack of respect, Haman further reveals his own inner Amalekite by targeting not only Mordechai, but Mordechai's entire people. And in his genocidal mania, he illustrates as well that he has learned the king's weakness. He presents himself before the king and broaches an anti-Semitic argument, one which echoes through the centuries from Haman to Mein Kampf. Yeshno am echad mufuzar u'mufarad bein ha'amim. There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all thy people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. The king agrees that this people should be destroyed. And then we are told, Hamelech v'Haman yashvu lishtot. Haman and the king sat down to drink, which indicates that again this is taking place in the context of imbibing, and that Haman has learned well that in order for the king to make a rash decision, one should have wine at the ready. A day is designated 11 months hence when all the anti-Semites in the empire are allowed to murder every Jew under the rule of Achashverosh. At this point, Mordechai the courtier becomes Mordechai the Jewish activist, donning sackcloth and screaming in the streets. He asks Esther to follow his own example, to storm into the throne room, crying and beseeching on behalf of her people. Esther faces a choice, to save herself or to risk her life for her nation. At first she is hesitant, telling her cousin that she has not seen the king for a month and that she is forbidden from entering the royal chamber without permission. Then in one of the most stirring verses in the Bible, Mordechai informs Esther of the eternity of the Jews, implicitly certain of salvation. The question, he says, is not whether the Jews will survive, but whether Esther will survive as a Jew. Think not that you will be protected in the king's house apart from all the other Jews. If you are silent at this time, sustenance and salvation shall arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will be lost. This is a very emotional assault on Esther. Mordechai seeks to communicate to her not only responsibility and loyalty, but also Jewish vulnerability. He is saying to her, you think, because of your position, you are not vulnerable. But anti-Semites target all Jews. And you, in the end, if you do not step forward, will be lost. Thus, there is a profound lesson about Jewish vulnerability and its universality that is being communicated here. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik's memory from his year studying in Berlin bears quoting. Quite often, he wrote, quote, certain Jews think that they can escape the challenge and the destiny that other Jews have to meet. There were German Jews I knew, he said, who maintained that what happened to others could not happen to them, for a variety of reasons: cultural, sociological, economic, political. I could not argue with them, Rabbi Soloveitchik reflected, because their reasons were solid. They were very integrated into society, and society would not be able to get along without them. I always kept quiet. But, he concluded, the historical experience of the Nazi epoch proved the opposite. All Jews are vulnerable. Al tadami b'nafshech. This is Mordechai's message. Think not that you will be protected apart from all the Jews. Esther internalizes what Mordechai is attempting to communicate. And yet what follows after is often profoundly misunderstood. Mordechai galvanized Esther into action, but she did not follow his plan, which was to storm immediately into her husband's throne room and demand that the Jews be speared. This would have ended with Esther's certain death. Imagine barging before the king, where no one is allowed to enter, and announcing to her husband, a man known for fits of rage, that she had kept him in the dark about her origins the entire time. Imagine how embarrassed he would have been to discover that he had consigned his own wife's people to death without any knowledge of who his wife actually was. And having been made a fool, would not his anger turn immediately on Esther, and by extension, the people on behalf of whom she has come to plead? Esther knows that Mordechai's plan will not work, and instead she asks her cousin to assemble the Jews of Shushan to fast and pray on her behalf, and then devises within the court a plan of her own making. The striking fact is that even as Mordechai is the initial instigator of Jewish salvation, it is not the Jewish member of the king's court, but rather this young queen who shows true cunning, statesmanship, political wisdom. It is this seeming neophyte at politics, rather than her father figure, who develops the plan that ensures the salvation of the Jewish people. As Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote, quote, Mordechai held the view that immediate spontaneous action on the part of Esther is inevitable. Esther should appear before the king, taking the risk of being rejected and executed, and plead with him hysterically to spare her people. Esther, he writes, did not concur with Mordechai. Esther, with her incisive intelligence, understood that no plea addressed to the king would produce any result. Hysterical crying, supplication, begging would at best be ineffectual. At worst, they may cause the infliction of more harm. Since Haman had succeeded in brainwashing Achashverosh and in arousing in him paranoid mortal fear of assassins and rebels, there was no power in the world that would be capable of dissuading Achashverosh from destroying all of his imaginary enemies. Could anyone, Rabbi Soloveitchik writes, sway Stalin from his mad designs? Esther, Rabbi Soloveitchik continues, could avail herself of one method only, namely to turn the tables on Haman, to arouse doubts in the sick king's mind concerning Haman's loyalty and devotion. Esther, therefore, asked the Jewish people to pray for her, but what she does is engage in strategic thinking and grand strategy. She lays out her plan over several days, playing on the insecurities of a paranoid king. Twice she invites him to a private mishteh, which means drinking party, but she invites him along with Haman. We must consider what this must have meant and how this must have sounded to the king. It is akin to inviting your husband to a romantic anniversary dinner, and then also inviting his best friend. Yoram Chazoni, in his book on Esther, notes the importance of pronouns in the two invitations that are issued. Speaking in third person, Esther originally invites, quote, the king and Haman to attend a drinking party that I have prepared for him, leaving who him is utterly ambiguous. For whom, Achashverosh must be wondering? For me? For my vizier? Why is my vizier even here? Then he comes to the party with all this festering in his mind and asks Esther what she desires, what is her request. And again she invites the king and Haman to another party where she will reveal her request. But here she calls the drinking feast the mishteh, the party asher e'aseh lahem, the feast that I will make for them, for the king and for Haman. Again, the psychological fears fester. Mordecai's plan seems so simplistic compared to the utter elegance of Esther's intrigue. Finally, with the king's jealousy built up, precisely when he is drunk at the second party, Esther seizes the opportunity, reveals her Jewishness, and then the king immediately orders Haman to be hanged. Esther then pleads with the king to lift the decree against the Jews, and when the king instead declares that he will throw his support to those who wish to battle against the anti-Semites, the Jews wage war against Haman's allies and emerge victorious. And then again it is Esther who asks her husband for another day to wage war, and, as Julia Streicher mentioned, to strike fear in the hearts of Haman's allies by hanging the 10 defeated sons of Haman on the gallows. Haman had perhaps taken advantage of the king's propensity for rash rage over drink, and Esther achieves Haman's undoing in the same manner, but with brilliance and forethought. It is with this in mind that we can begin to understand why this biblical book is named for Esther rather than Mordecai. As we mentioned in our lectures on the Bible, Esther, throughout the book, has a political appellation appended to her name. She is almost always Esther HaMalka, Esther the Queen. Why are they telling us this? We know she's married to the king. We know she's the queen. The answer is critical. The term is there to emphasize that she, not Mordecai, was the true political actor, the true statesman. Mordecai, Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote, was the initiator, the teacher, the first messenger. He awakened her, he fired her imagination and sensitized her heart. Through him came the inspired word to her. Yet the strategy was hers, the critical decisions how and when to do it were hers. She could not consult Mordecai, and even if she could, she would not have accepted advice from him. End quote. We are therefore left reading the story with gratitude that Mordecai ignited Esther's activism, reminded her of the need to step forward, reminded her of the collective vulnerability and responsibility of the Jewish people. But we are also left with gratitude that Esther understood that Mordecai's plan was utter folly. But how could Mordecai have not understood this? How could he have asked Esther to just barge in before the royal presence? Ronald Reagan often told a joke in which an American and Russian are describing their respective polities. And the American says, what's so great about the United States is that I have the right to speak up. I can walk right into the White House. I can walk straight into the Oval Office. I can bang my hand on the desk, and I can say, I don't like the way Ronald Reagan is running his country. And the Russian says, well, I can do that. And the American says, what do you mean? And the Russian says, absolutely. I can go straight into the Kremlin. I can go straight into Gorbachev's office. I can bang my hand on his desk. And I can say, I don't like the way Ronald Reagan is running his country. And so, did Mordecai think this was America? Should Esther suddenly surprise a paranoid tyrant and tell him, I was lying to you about who I am, and by the way, I don't like the way you're running your country? What did Mordecai have in mind? How could he have suggested such a strategy to Esther? Here I think we can discover an insight that is essential for our own analysis of the evolution of Jewish statesmanship. Rabbi Soloveitchik has stressed, in his own essays on Esther, that this is one of the very few books of the Bible that was written at a turning point in Jewish history, when prophets were disappearing from the Jewish people. At that time, he wrote, the covenantal community was losing slowly but surely the most precious of all gifts, prophecy. The great covenantal dialogue between man and God that had commenced with Abraham was about to be terminated, and the prophetic community faced a stark, ruthless reality, a non-prophetic existence. End quote. And what this means, I think, is not only that Revelation is coming to a close, but also that the entire method of political engagement is about to evolve. In earlier books of the Bible, aside from the kings themselves, the central actors on the political stage are prophets. Sometimes these prophets are leaders, Joshua, Samuel, but more often they are taking on leaders, Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah. From a political perspective, what is the job of a prophet? The role is to come and proclaim what is true, what is just, what is right. God takes care of the rest. If Ahab the wicked, king of Israel, murders and steals, in Israelites' land. It may not be politically prudent for a subject of this king to storm into the throne room and tell him, I don't like the way you're running the country, but that does not stop Elijah, who has no compunctions and does exactly what Mordechai wanted Esther to do. Storm into the throne room and say, Haratzachta v'gam yarashta, shall you murder and also inherit. Natan HaNavi, Nathan the prophet, is well aware that King David, the great King David, has just gotten rid of Bathsheba's husband by sending him to the front. He knows that the king could very well get rid of him again, and yet his job, his duty, is to show up in David's throne room and pronounce, Atah ha'ish, you are the man who did this. Jeremiah, at the end of the First Temple period, knows that he may well be thrown in the dungeon, as he was, for pronouncing his prophecy of doom to the last kings of Judah, but pronounce them nevertheless he does. This, of course, is the approach that Mordechai adopts. And when we ponder the text carefully, we are able to understand why. The secret lies in Mordechai's biography. Who is he? He is, we are informed, son of Yair, Mordechai, whose father experienced the end of the kingdom of Judea, of the First Temple, of the age of Jeremiah, and of Huldah and other prophets. This was the model of political action that Mordechai's father experienced. This was the model, the prophetic model of political action that Mordechai had imbibed from birth. This was the model of leadership that was part of his patrimony. If Mordechai's father had been exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, if his father had been among the elites exiled with the Judean king Jechoniah, then his father was almost certainly an intimate of these prophets. And in Babylonia he would have known Ezekiel and Daniel, who fearlessly proclaimed their visions and did so in the streets and the courts of pagan kings. But Esther, we are further informed, lost her parents as a child. She was raised by Mordechai. Unlike Mordechai, Esther knew none of the generation of Judea, of the age when prophets storm royal courts with the words, Thus saith the Lord. And perhaps these respective biographies lend a deeper dimension to these two heroes' perspectives. To be a Jew is to be taught by your parents about those who have lived before, so that these historic figures never truly die. I recently spoke to a large Christian audience about the lessons of the life of Abraham Lincoln. At the end of the talk, a priest stood up and he asked me, how should we make Lincoln relevant to today's youth? After all, he says, Lincoln is dead. He died a long time ago. Students don't see Lincoln as relevant. Young people don't see Lincoln as relevant. I confess, upon hearing this question, I was flummoxed for a moment. Because all I do as a parent is to teach my children to revere individuals like Abraham, who lived long before Lincoln did. One is reminded of when Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik was asked for a reaction on the occasion of the 750th anniversary of Maimonides' death. I asked Rabbi Soloveitchik, it's the 750th anniversary of Maimonides' death. What are your views on this moment? And he responded, this is the first time that I've ever heard that Maimonides is no longer alive. This is what it means to be raised by Jewish parents. The challenge, however, is that even as we remain loyal to the legacy of those who have lived before, this does not mean that we should always do exactly as they did. Because these great individuals live on within us, we are therefore tempted to do exactly as they did, to live exactly as they lived. But different moments present us with different challenges. How Elijah acted before a king is not necessarily how we should act before a king. Israel is not Persia, and Israel's age of prophecy is not the age of Achashverosh. Mordechai is linked through his parents to a vision of the Jewish past. Jeremiah, Nathan, Elijah live in his soul. He seeks, therefore, to act as a prophetic figure. He storms the streets of Shushan. He tells Esther to act as Elijah would have done, to essentially storm in and say, Thus saith the Lord, I don't like the way you're running your country. But Esther, whose parents had died when she was young, Esther, who has grown up within Persian culture, who so seamlessly adapts to the palace of the king, understands that now a new method, not prophecy which is coming to a close, but political cunning, is required. The irony, then, is that Esther, precisely perhaps because she is less connected to the legends of the past, is actually best able to help ensure the Jewish future. Here perhaps a comparison can be made to the most visionary modern Jewish political leaders, Herzl and Jabotinsky. Interestingly, both of them came from outside the traditional Jewish society, to whom they often spoke. But that was precisely perhaps the reason why they were also politically able to think outside the box, so that when they chose to throw their lot in with their people, they were able to see what others could not. A Zionist movement already existed before Herzl, but it is he who comes from outside the larger Jewish world is able to see that what is required is the creation of political institutions and the engagement of political leaders as Jewish statesmen, an insight that leads to the Zionist Congress and ultimately the Balfour Declaration. Jabotinsky grew up in an Odessa not unlike Shushan, a city of multiple peoples, languages, and identities, very different from the shtetl or the Jewish communities of Vilna or Frankfurt. But it is he who understands that Jews need to learn to fight, to create an army, and that only then could Jewish safety in the Holy Land be ensured. Both were largely dismissed by many of their compatriots, but both saw what few others could see. Now Esther, of course, is not Jabotinsky and Herzl. She has profoundly religious roots. She is a devout Jew. She asks all of Israel and Shushan to fast and pray for her. That is part of her heroism. But she also grew up in a Persia without parents and was so seamlessly part of the larger culture that she could disguise her identity. And perhaps because of this unusual origin, she is also prescient that a new politics is required in the post-prophetic age. Rabbi Soloveitchik, writing about Esther, puts it this way, quote, "The Torah tells us the story of the prophetic community at the hour of triumph, at the hour of revelation and direct contact with God. But Esther, he says, faced a new question. How can the Jew triumph over his adversaries and enemies if God has stopped speaking to him, if the cryptic messages he receives remain unintelligible and incomprehensible?" It is here that Esther emerges as the originator, the inventor, the mother of Jewish diaspora politics. The age of prophecy is coming to an end. A new approach to safeguarding the Jewish people in a hostile environment needs to be adopted, while retaining the faith and the loyalty of the past. Esther still wishes all Israelites to fast for her, to pray for her, but her own actions are performed with intuition, with intrigue. She understands that while one must still see oneself as an agent of providence, nevertheless, when no clear revelation has been given, one must also operate on instinct, reflecting a mastery of realpolitik. Or, as Isaiah Berlin wrote in the essay that we cited last week, great leaders facing a crisis, quote, grasp the unique combination of characteristics that constitute this particular situation. This and no other, end quote. Esther embodies this description, emerging as a woman for all seasons, a hero celebrated year after year in the celebration of in the holiday of Purim. If Esther embodies the birth of diaspora politics, it is because her tale teaches us the eternal vulnerability of the Jews and the eternal necessity, therefore, not only of vigilance, but of political judgment and wisdom. We celebrate this story, but Esther's triumph, rightly understood, leaves us also with a deep sense of foreboding as to her future. After all, ladies and gentlemen, considering all that we have learned, all she understood, how can she be certain of her own security? Could those who suddenly found favor with Henry VIII in the Tudor court remain confident of their future well-being? If Thomas Cromwell took the place of Thomas More, did not Cromwell eventually also suffer More's fate? Was not Anne Boleyn, who replaced Catherine, herself in the end executed by the mercurial, megalomaniacal, Meshuggah monarch that was her husband? Could not Mordecai and Esther themselves ultimately also end up on the gallows? Absolutely. Rabbi Soloveitchik rightly reflected that, quote, if a prime minister who just yesterday enjoyed the full confidence and trust of the king was suddenly executed, then who is wise and clairvoyant enough to assure us that the same unreasonable, absurd, neurotic change of mood and mind will not repeat itself? The Purim tale reminds us that a government and the society it oversees can suddenly turn against its most vulnerable in a matter of moments. That is why, rightly understood, Esther's story is no triumphal tale. On the contrary, it is, as Rabbi Soloveitchik put it, the book of the vulnerability of man in general, and specifically the vulnerability of the Jew. And if, ladies and gentlemen, despite this terrifying lesson, we continue to celebrate Purim, it is because we are marking and rejoicing in the heroism of a woman who comes to understand Jewish vulnerability and in response leaves us her political genius as her legacy. It is true, we are fond of the book of Esther. But the lessons of Esther are not always learned. The great scholar of Spanish Jewry, Professor Bencio Netanyahu, points out that even though the Inquisition had already existed for some time, had already begun its monstrous activity, many of the leaders of Sephardic Jewry never seemed to see the expulsion coming. This, he wrote, was due to what he called, quote, man's natural reluctance to draw radical conclusions, which imply uprooting oneself from a comfortable spot. Professor Netanyahu added that just as German Jews, quote, failed to foresee Hitler's rise to power at any time during the period preceding that rise, so the Jews of Spain failed to notice, even a few years before the expulsion, the mountainous wave which was approaching to overwhelm them, end quote. Professor Bencio Netanyahu's son, who himself went into a career other than academia, spoke at his father's funeral and quoted his father as saying that, quote, a necessary component for any living body, and a nation is a living body, is the ability to identify a danger in time, end quote. I agree, but equally important as identifying the danger is having not only the courage but also the political genius necessary to address and remove the danger. That is an ability that Esther herself reflects here, and that is why every Purim we honor her above all. In 2012, a book was published in France called The Esther Code, which became a big bestseller. The book argued that the hanging of the 10 Nuremberg Nazis was providentially predicted in the book named for this Jewish queen. If one looks at the actual scroll in which we read Esther's tale on Purim, one notes that as the sons of Haman, the 10 sons of Haman, are listed, the Hebrew letters Taf, Shin, and Zayin are written in an unusual manner. Those letters, numerically interpreted according to this book, reference the Hebrew year, Hey Taf Shin Zayin, 5707, the year in which Julius Streicher and his comrades met their maker, as he died with the words of Purim on his lips. The book further notes that originally and eerily, 11 Nazis were sentenced by the Nuremberg tribunal to hang on that day. But Goering committed suicide in his cell the night before, thereby allowing for the perfect parallel, 10 sons of Haman, 10 Nazis at Nuremberg. Thus, for the book proving a prophecy hidden in the story itself. Perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not mystically minded in this manner, and for me, what is essential to understand is that there is indeed an Esther code, but it is a code of conduct that Esther's story demands of all of us. It was Karl Marx who famously commented that history repeats itself first as tragedy and the second time as farce. But Marx, a self-hating Jew, was wrong. History repeats itself precisely because it is anything other than farce. It repeats itself because in every generation there are those who rise up against us to destroy us. And the book of Esther reminds us of the necessity of courage and political wisdom in facing this eternal threat. The example of Esther thus embodies the fragility of Jewish security, but also the possibility of statesmanship and heroism in the face of this vulnerability. Whenever we celebrate Esther's example, we are reminded why, in the face of hate, we must remain ever vigilant, and why we continue to joyously celebrate Purim all the same. Thank you very much.